He simply poured honey into the overseer's ear and waited for the ants to arrive. The sentence hung in Bento's head like a small, sharp thing, half proposal, half prayer, as he moved through the night. Heat clung to his shirt and to the air, a wet blanket that smelled of smoke from the cook fires. Rotting cane and the sharp, sickly sweetness of molasses spilled in barrels near the mill. Lantern light leaked in rectangles from the big house windows, where shutters had been drawn more out of habit than necessity. They kept the world at arm's length, the way the Barão kept his wealth at a distance from the people who made it. Beyond the house, mosquito whistles and the nearer tinny chorus of men snoring under their hammocks made the plantation feel like a living thing that breathed only to keep itself fed. Bento was part of that breathing, but he was never its center. He had been a stable hand for as long as he could remember, given to the new name the estate's ledger assigned him, and accustomed to being a shadow. He knew the smell of the horses as well as the smell of fear. He knew the particular creak in Brandão's cabin door that betrayed the overseer's stumbling gait. He could tell by the pattern of footprints in the dry earth which of the guards had passed by the Senzala that evening. His hands were darkened at the nails with grease and sugar. The skin at his knuckles had been beaten into calluses that hid small, pale scars. He moved now like someone who had spent his life learning how to be unseen. Brandão slept with cheap liquor warmed in his belly, and the satisfaction of another child's teeth gone from the Senzala table. That had become the man's ritual lately. A shipment of youngsters sold off to make sure the Barão's ledgers balanced, a crude barter of infancy and freedom for coin. The Barão permitted it, a little commerce to keep the margins tidy, and Valadares, the Capitão do Mato, held the leash when the Barão's attention wandered. Brandão, who could not be trusted when sober, and who doubled his cruelty when drunk, kept the enterprise running with whips and threats. Bento had watched a deal in the quarter-silver light of late afternoon, a carriage arriving quiet as a thief, whispers, a girl's hand taken and shoved into someone's lap, while a man counted paper and pushed the coins into Brandão's palm with reverence. The girl's face had been pale as lard and small as a cup. She had been Zulema. Zulema was why Bento had stayed awake the night the plan took shape. She was 8 or 9, with a laugh like the chiming of spoons against a pot, and a gravity around her that kids who had survived more than children shouldered early. There was a way she clung to the old cook, the grandmother who had taught generations of children how to pick the bones from the beans, and the sight of that clutching wrist when Brandão's men had taken her had stayed inside Bento like a weight. He had tried to tell himself that rage alone could not be enough to break open the fence of danger, but rage had days to live beside cunning, and Bento, more than anything, trusted small, exact cunning. He had not discovered the ants by accident. The plantation's land ran thin into scrub, and then into the darker forest where the cane ended and the earth grew serious. Army ants, taocas, men in the house called them, in the way a thing can be named to lessen its strangeness, marched in long, hungry columns when the weather allowed. Bento had seen them once on a path, a black river flowing over a carcass, over beetles, dragging at a fallen lizard, until it was merely a memory of meat. He had watched them cross a fallen log and felt a kind of awful respect. They were not cruel in the human sense. Their hunger was simple, precise. They were blind to politics. The idea came to him over the course of a week, beginning with a moment so small that he almost failed to notice it. He had pocketed a dab of molasses from the edge of a jar, sweet, thick as tar, and pressed it between 2 fingers to taste, like a man reminding himself that sweetness could make the world turn. A drop fell on the earth near the kitchen door. By morning, a line of ants had found it, and as if reading a beacon, extended their path out from it in a way that bent the world into a map Bento could use. He tested it deliberately. At dusk, he took a single drop and put it on a leaf a few paces into the scrub, then settled on a root to watch. Only a handful of minutes passed before the first scout found the sugar and left a faint chemical whisper for its sisters. The column arrived like a train of tiny feet, not in habit but in profession. They flowed across the leaf, along the ground, and then up the bark, until the place of sweetness looked like a stage crowded with black actors. Bento felt something loosen in his chest. The army did not judge. They only followed scent and need. They offered him a tool that required nothing supernatural, only patience and timing. It remained a terrible thing in its own logic. He understood what it could do to a man. He understood what it could mean for a plantation. The death of an overseer would be interpreted in ways that could scar an entire senzala. He understood, too, that Bento, for all his stoutness, slept in a cabin of flammable thatch, and that Valadares's mind, when crossed with fear, travelled quickly to land burns and public example. Bento felt the weight of that choice like a stone in the small of his back. He did not mistake calculation for righteousness. He was not inventing justice out of blood. He was improvising resistance in wood and sugar. The night he decided, the moon had been cut to a sliver. He had gone to the barroom of the sugar house under the guise of needing a broken harness repaired, lingering near the barrels where the molasses was siphoned into jars for the kitchen. There were smells that should have been ordinary to him, yeast and cane, leather and sweat, and yet his hand trembled when he finally had a small jar clutched in his palm. It was a common thing, molasses kept in a tin, used for sweetening porridge or sealing wounds. It would not be missed for a night. The first part of his plan required no breaking of locks. Bento had a way of sleeping that was careless. The drunken man nursed the bottle like a talisman, even when he dozed, and he liked to sleep with his head near the lip of the hammock so that he could hear the door. Bento had watched that pattern for months and memorized where Brando's ear rested when the man turned. He had waited for the bottle's last dregs to loosen the overseer's hand. He had practiced the motion of pouring on his own, a small secret rehearsal with a spoon and a dried stick, enough to know how the thick sweetness would gather and run. He did not like the word honey. The word made the thing seem gentle. He told himself he would call it molasses if anyone ever asked, but the title that lodged in his mind sounded like an accusation. It rang true with a bitter poetry, too stubborn to be cleansed. He moved with it, like a lit match. There was a time when he might have taken Brando's throat with a sharpened tool. He had the chance in the dark of a night months before, when Bento stumbled alone between the barns and a cane stalk snagged the man's heel. Bento had come close enough that he could have done the thing. He had felt the blade's cold question in his palm and had walked away. Killing, up close and personal, had the bluntness of a hammer and the consequence of a season of terror at the Cenzala's heart. The molasses offered something else. It was indirect. It hid behind the world of ants. It made cruelty meet the indifferent hunger of nature. It was less intimate, perhaps less honorable, but it had a cunning that felt like survival. On the night he acted, the air was a slow, heavy thing. Brando's cabin sat a little apart from the others, its roof hung with a thatch browned and softened by years. The door had been closed, but the net curtain over the hammock had not been pulled. Bento opened the latch door softly and slipped inside. The lamplight cast the room in a fist of orange. The ashtray by the bed was full, and a bottle lay like a small animal under the hammock. Bento breathed in a heavy rhythm, snoring the way that men with excess drink did, as if sleep were a second stomach digesting the day's cruelties. Bento moved without sound. The molasses jar was cupped in his hand like contraband. He could see the overseer's head tilt back, the ear exposed. For a second, in the close, sanctified dark, Bento's entire life seemed to be the span of that small moment. He bent, not like a man ready to strike a head off, but like a man making a small, precise deposit into an opening. The jar made a low, wet whisper against the inside of Brando's ear as he tipped it. A thick pearl of dark sugar pooled and then began to run, sticky and slow, down the hairs of the man's cheek, down to the pillow, and then over the rough weave of the hammock. Bento used a finger to catch the drop as it ran, guiding it through a line across the blanket, under the hammock's rim, out of the cabin and onto the floor, where a soft camouflaged trail would lead out through the threshold and across the beaten earth to the spot where the ants had been found. He worked with a patience and attention he had learned from grooming horses, careful movements, comparing textures, measuring the distance the sweetness needed to travel for scent, to carry without dilution. The trail glittered faintly in the lamplight like a quicksilver seam. He did not hurry. The plan required slowness. He pressed a smear along the footboard, along the door jamb, and then out, jamming the jar back into the pocket of his shirt before the lantern flame could betray him. The taste of the sugar still lingered on his fingers, sour with the memory of idiots who thought money could buy children. He left no fingerprints he could not imagine, only the mess of the world and a thin path that would do the rest. As he retreated into the night, the plantation felt on edge in a way it had not the hour before. The distant dogs, usually steady with their chain and gum, had a higher pitch, as if they sensed a change in the wind. Bento paused at the edge of the scrub and watched for what he knew would come. He had to wait in the dark, unblinking, while the world did its own decisions. It had not taken long before the ants found the trail. They were like a rumor that grew into a crowd, one small scout and then another, and then a swelling procession. The first touch of movement he saw was beneath the moon-silvered stump where he had left the first dab earlier. The ground seemed to have a new line, a black river threading through dust. Bento's breath tempered out small clouds in the humid air as he leaned forward to watch. Their arrival was not dramatic in a human sense. It was a steady, devouring tide. The column threaded along his trail like a story finding its moral. They made no decisions. They only answered what was present. The closer they came to the cabin, the more they swelled until the line was an unbroken black rope from the scrub to the hammock where Barão slept. Then the noise began. At first it was a shuffling, a friction against fabric and wood. Barão stirred, turning in a way that sent a ripple through the hammock. He muttered and opened one eye, saw the black skein moving over the edges of the bed, and flung out his arms in panic. He bellowed with a kind of animal astonishment and tore himself free of the netting. The lamplight jittered as his hands knocked it. The smell of the drink, hot and sour, mixed with the dark of the night and the chiming of the sugar-coated insects. Bento watched from the shadow of a bush and felt both vindication and a terrible coldness settle in him. Barão's shouts were raw and animal, calling out for help between the curses and the thrashing. Men came running, their feet hitting the earth like arguments. A guard's lantern bobbed red and yellow, swallowed and fed back the panic. The sound of bodies on the floor, the scattering of chairs, the clatter of a tin plate as someone tried to help in a frailty of method. All the plantation's human noise gathered into a moment of chaos, where the natural and the social collided. The ants did not dissect Barão with any sense of justice. They did what they had come to do. They coursed over the exposed skin, into the folds, and under the fingernails he frantically dragged across his face. The overseer slapped and growled and cursed, the way a trapped animal might. Bento did not watch the smallest of details. He watched the way the men around Barão reacted, shouting, beating back at something they did not understand. He watched as the kitchen boys came with blankets and water and knives, and as the overseer, large and blusterous, turned into a smaller thing under the weight of the world's indifference and his own choices. It was in its logic sudden, in its consequences slower. Barão's death, if it came, which the shouting and the blood suggested might, would not be a neat end. It would be an event that loosened other things, and the plantation had a way of organizing events into punishments. Bento's throat was as tight as when he had watched Zulerma's wrist pry free from the grandmother's hold. He could have done nothing and let the column be the story's only author, but he knew better than to be naive. One of the lamplights flared toward the scrub where Bento stood, and the sound of a horse's hooves broke through the trees. Valadares arrived in the dark, like a punctuation mark, his figure carved against the lighter sky, the Capitão do Mato tall and severe, face set with a habitual hunger for order and recognition. He had been away when the sale happened. He had been near the town collecting favors and men, and now his presence made everything worse. Men fell silent with that peculiar moment when a tyrant enters the room. Their own fear rearranges itself into fewer, sharper edges. Valadares saw Barão first, his mouth a flat line as he took in the overseer's state. He saw the trail, too, the smeared molasses like a child's game that had turned mortal. He did not need long to find a conclusion. He was not a man who lingered in the fog of uncertainty, when a display could secure his advantage. He strode to the doorway, peered in, and his voice, when he spoke, cut across the noise with a kind of officialness that felt like a sentence. "Murder, then," he said, as if reciting a ledger. "Someone wants to test what happens when we do not answer with fire." He did not say it softly. He said it the way a man practiced in punishment would, to start the engine of fear. He turned to the group of workers huddled on the Chenzala's edge, and there was an instant in which all the men's faces made a single crease of comprehension. A body could be called the justification for a spectacle. If this was done from within the senzala, Valadares continued, then the Barão will want example. Burn one hut, and the rest will remember. Burn the largest, and the lesson will be taught for a generation. We will search them. I will have them beaten until the story comes out. His gaze landed on where the Kenzala's line of huts lay, small and close as a child's hands. The old cook, Zulerma's grandmother, stepped forward before anyone could think her smallness worth the bargain of silence. Her eyes were steady, a kind of stone. She called for calm and reason, but reason in that moment was a useless commodity when Valadares had already chosen punishment in his mouth. Bento crouched still among the roots and felt the air around him thicken like a syrup. He had hoped the ants would be an answer that would break Brando's capacity to harm. He had not imagined Valadares's appetite for rotation of authority, nor that the Barão would measure the death against his profit and come down with a ferocious desire to keep his estate orderly. The Capitão's mind, quick as it was cruel, would prefer a scapegoat over the truth of a system that sold people's children. There were 100 ways this could unspool. There were the literal ones, torches at the senzala, fists and iron to beat confessions, a night of punishment that would hush the survivors into a longer silence than any single death could. There were longer, slower consequences too, more patrols, tighter rations, the Barão's suspicion that his own men had been infiltrated by a boldness that could threaten profit. Bento felt his mouth go dry. He had come armed only with a jar of sweetness and a small, terrible knowledge of where to push the world to get a reaction. He had not imagined rescuing Zulerma and then heading straight into the teeth of Valadares's retribution. He had imagined something cleaner, the overseer felled, the child safe, the senzala breathing out perhaps for a night, but the world was not neat, not here. In the mass of confusion, his eyes slid to the saddle of Valadares's horse, which had been tethered at the barn. There had, 2 nights earlier, been a satchel, one that Valadares kept close, stuffed with the small papers that mattered, receipts, slips, the dirty notes of deals cut under the house's rafters. Bento had, in another life, been a boy who delivered messages. His memory held the root of the estate like a palm. If he could get those papers into the hands of the Barão, or at least make them fall into a place where the Barão would see them, then maybe the Capitão's role in any clandestine trading could be exposed. It could produce a split between Valadares and the Barão, and in that split find the senzala a little room to breathe, to... He thought the thought quickly, as a man does when he must decide whether to move from observation to action. It came with an awareness of risks stacked like chips. If Valadares smelled deceit, he would be merciless. If Bento were found in the act, he would be tortured for fact and entertainment both. But he also understood the logic of men with reputations. Valadares had built his with a certain greed, and there were ledger lines that could be turned. His leg moved under him like a lit wire. He shifted his weight and slipped from the bush. The night opened with his movement, the way water opens to a fish. He crossed the yard with the ease of a man who had spent his life mapping the small hollows in the earth and the soft, worn places in the floorboards. The men who had gone to Brando's aid had left flustered and not in a formation that would see him coming. He was careful with each footfall because he knew that, in a moment like this, sound brought you a new kind of peril. He reached the barn where Valadares's horse was tethered and crouched low. The night smelled of the animal, the horse's heat like a second moon. The satchel was there, heavier than the air, slung from the saddle horn. He knew from passing glimpses during the Barão's entertainments and the night Valadares had stayed in the stable house to sleep, that the satchel was not bolted. A man who trusted his power trusted it into so many little habits, and those habits could be pried. Bento worked with a speed tempered by the necessity of silence. He slid a hand under the flap, fingers finding the papers. The receipts were small, the inked words cramped and shorthand-laden. His fingers brushed across the names and sums like a man reading the underside of a ledger. He felt a kind of grand, careful theft, not the hijacking of money, but the theft of a chain's map. He shoved the papers into the inner seam of his shirt, feeling their roughness against his chest. The world narrowed to the quickness of breath and the friction of cloth. Before he could pull away, a footfall behind him stopped him cold. He had not expected anyone to be at the barn yet. But the plantation was a place of secrets that sometimes moved like animals. He froze, listening. There were voices, low and bitter, from the direction of the Cenzala. Valladares was speaking still, perhaps into the night air like some sort of proclamation. The men around him were moving with a result in their movement. They were setting torches into positions, eyes searching for an ember to turn into a law. Bento decided he could not return to the Cenzala to warn them. If he ran back, all his movements would be noticed, and he would be a visible cause of suspicion. He instead moved to the edge of the barn and waited, solace taken in the world's shadows. He felt something strange then. Not hope exactly, but a decision that the chain of events could be nudged. If Valladares was calling for burning and brandishing his enforcement, perhaps, Bento thought, there was a way to break the chain down the middle. He would need to be careful, and he would need to be quick. The papers in his shirt were a live thing beneath his ribs. They smelled faintly of ink and tobacco and the oil the men used to pack them away. He nearly felt their small authority like a second heart. He slid from the barn and then, as if displacing himself into the story he wanted, stepped quietly toward the main house where he guessed the Barão would come when reports reached him. He did not yet know how to get the papers to fall into the right hands. He only knew that such papers could be used like a wedge. Behind him, the night kept unspooling in its loud and human ways. The overseer's screams had dwindled into the soft, muttering talk of men aligning in the belief that a spectacle of violence would heal inconvenience. The men who had been pulled from the Cenzala to respond to the commotion were now, Bento assumed, returning. Men traded whispers like currency here. Every rumor was a live, coiling thing that could spring or suffocate. The old cook had come out of the Cenzala and had stood, the way an old tree stands in a storm, while the men around her gestured. She had locked eyes with someone, a guard or a boy, and said nothing loud, but said enough that Bento, watching, could tell she had seen where Zulerma's hand had been taken, and wanted nothing more than to keep what was left within the hut. Her face had the lines of long grief, and an authority unmatched by her physical size. She would not be easily cowed. Bento had liked her, and he wanted, more than he wanted anything, for Zulerma to have a night where her breath was undisturbed. He moved then with a resolve that felt like a pressed blade in the hollows of his palm. There were more decisions to make, risks to accept. In the dark near the well, he thought of the child asleep in some narrow corner, perhaps with the old cook's hand on her shoulder. The memory of that grip had been the fulcrum of his decision. He thought of the way Brando had sold the girl's small body, as if it were a sack of sugar, and felt the heat of that memory like something that could set him burning. He did not yet know what the morning would bring. He only knew there was a thread he could pull, and that if he did not pull it, the plantation would knot tight with the same old violence. He had started a cascade when he poured the molasses into Brando's ear. The cascade now was part natural, part human, and it would not stop at one body. As he walked toward the big house, the sound of boots on the yard punctuated the air. There was a new urgency to the night, men moving with torches, voices layered with command and fear. He folded himself into a doorway to avoid being seen, and pressed the papers tight to his chest, feeling their edges bite the ribs. In his mind, he prepared the small, dirty theatre he would perform, a dropped satchel here, a shuffled slip there, a stumble that would let paper fall like revelation before the Barão's eyes. It was a dangerous gambit that required fooling men whose livelihood was suspicion. The last thing he did before stepping out was look toward the Cenzala, where a flicker of shadow told him the old cook was still standing sentinel. The line of small huts was a beaded chain under the moon, bodies inside noses to the blanket, some breathing like slow drums. If Valladares chose to burn, those drums would be smothered under smoke and fear. He thought of Zulerma's hand again, and of how small that hand had seemed against brutal men and bigger fortunes. He thought of the molasses on Brando's ear, a child's jest into a man's ruin, and he felt a wash of something that tasted like relief and like guilt at once. He took a step and then another, and the sound of the plantation rearranged itself to the movement of his feet. The night prepared its response, and Bento, who had poured the sweetness into the overseer's ear and watched the ants obey the chemical hymn, moved into the part of the story where men made their own decisions. He had waited for ants to arrive. Now He would wait and see what the living men decided to do with the mess he had made. A lantern swung to his left. Voices rose, closer, and the smell of smoke, perhaps from torches being lit in preparation, began to fill the air. Bento pressed himself to the wall of the big house's service wing and felt the rough whitewash under his palm. Somewhere inside, the Barão's house set its own rhythms of indifference, a slow drink, a heavier bed, a man counting gains that night unaware of the small, treacherous calculus unfolding in his yard. Bento breathed in the heavy air and let out a slow, careful breath. The papers burned under his shirt like a truth he had stolen from the darkness, and the smell of molasses that had sent the line of ants to Brando's bed still clung to his fingers. He had made a terrible choice using the material of the plantation itself, sugar against the overseer, the forest's army marched by scent. He had bought, for the span of an hour, an opportunity. He had also lit a fuse. Footsteps approached, with a determination that was not random. Valladares's voice came thinly, more measured now, as if someone had fed him extra control for the purposes of terrors he meant to command. He could hear the pipes hiss and the noises of men being moved into places where they would be watched and where they would be made to confess. There was a kerfuffle at the Cenzala's boundary, a man's curse, a child's muffled whimper. Bento felt the night's momentum tilt. He had the papers. He had to choose his next action, and in choosing he would give shape to either a reprieve or a new round of wounds. He could not know which, only that the small sweetness he had poured had accomplished the small thing he had intended. Brando no longer hurt children this night, and had unleashed the larger machinery of punishment. A dog bayed in the distance, sharp as a bell. Bento stepped from the shadow and moved, not with the quickness of a thief, but with the deliberation of someone who had decided that secrecy now must be traded for consequence. He would have to place his gamble where it might cleave Valladares from the Barão, or at least show the Barão that his own officer had too thin a conscience. He would have to make a lie of the night's simplicity and turn it into proof. As he rounded the corner to the front steps of the big house, a torch swept the yard and pinned him to the wall with its light. For a fraction of a second, he imagined retreat, a route back to the Cenzala and the old cook's hut. But the torch's beam slid past him, and the men moved on. It was as if the night did not want to see him at all. Inside, the Barão had not yet stepped into the yard. He would not, for a man who had money and distance and servants to surface the mess. He would be notified, perhaps, and then if the papers found their way into his hands, he would feel his world tilt. Men like the Barão measured scandal in disrupted profit and in the possibility of public embarrassment. Valladares could be cut if the Barão thought his man had taken liberty with the master's good name. Bento's plan was to be precise and small. A satchel misplaced, a clumsy fall of paper, a servant who saw and hid a slip. He reached the steps and, with hands that did not tremble yet, set himself to work. He would stage an accident, something small, a tripping servant, a knocked satchel, and let the papers fall like scatterings of truth. He would watch the Barão's face when the sums appeared, when the names of buyers and the signatures of men who dealt in children's lives were revealed in ink. He knew that the Barão's love for order might jerk him toward justice or toward an even meaner solution. Both were possible. As he adjusted his fingers beneath the rail, he felt an ache across his ribs that was not quite a pain and not quite a memory. He had been beaten a season before for a minor theft he had not committed, and his side had never been the same. The moment of the molasses had left a residue of moral grime on his hands that he could not wash out. There was guilt in his fingers and solace in their action. He had saved a child. He had made a man pay. He had broken something he could not easily repair. Beyond the high windows, the watch of the big house shifted like an organism. Men moved papers and voices hummed in hushed registrations. Bento felt the world tilt again and edged forward, ready to create the stumble that might spare his friends and condemn the right man. But as his knee touched the step, a shout tore through the yard. Not Valladares's voice, not the Barão's, but the old cook's, and it carried the kind of sound that set the hair up on a man's neck. "Zulema," she called, and the name did something to the shape of the night. It was both warning and plea and claim. Bento froze. For a breath the night held everything suspended. Ants marching still under the hammock's frame. Men turned to the Zenzala, the Barão's house breathing behind its shutters. The papers moved like a live coal against his chest. The decision he had stowed in the dark waited for him to perform it. He had poured the sweetness into the overseer's ear and had watched the ants obey. He had done the small portion that made the impossible possible. Now he would have to choose what to do with the human consequences. He took one more step down from the porch, drawn not by the idea of confession, but by the urgent compulsion to keep Zulema's good breathing safe. He had waited for ants to arrive. What he had not done in the waiting was to imagine the bitterness that their arrival would set off in men who measured their authority with fire. He moved forward, toward the stuttering, immediate business of saving a life and of making a place for truth to lie where it might be found. The night, for its part, seemed to hold its breath with him. If you want more untold histories like this, subscribe and stay with the story. The old cook's cry had fractured the night and, in a moment, clarified Bento's path. He moved first toward the Zenzala, because that was where the human question waited. The lanterns and torches framed men who were already arguing and distributing themselves into roles, ones who would run to brandish, ones who would try to soothe, and ones who would wait to see whether fear took the shape of a whip or of silence. Bento slipped beneath that choreography and found the small hut where Zulema lay curled like a secret. The child was awake. The old cook's hand lay over her shoulder as if she could hold the world in that grip. Zulema's eyes were wide and silvered by a child's confusion. She had not seen the sight of Brandon's bed, not the movement of those ants, only heard the distant uproar and the sharp voice of men. When she felt Bento's presence, she did not scream. She reached for him with a trust that looked dangerous in the way it softened him. Her fingers were small and smelled faintly of cassava and of the bean broth she had been given that evening. He let her press her cheek against his forearm, felt her breathing against the fabric, and for a second, the absurdity of all the ledger lines and threats reduced to that mere warmth. "We must keep her here," the old cook said without rising, her voice a dry wind of common sense. "No place for a child to be seen by men with fire in their mouths." Bento nodded. He stayed long enough to make sure Zulema's breathing was steady, long enough to watch the old woman tuck the child's head under a thin blanket, and long enough to let his own resolve harden. The Zenzala would not be spared if the Capitão's appetite was not checked. He had to convert the stolen paper into a provocation that would tilt the Barão's attention toward Valadares and away from the huts. It was a dangerous calculation, one full of possibility and of equal peril. And it required timing the Barão's curiosity to find exactly the right kind of evidence. Not a story whispered by a boy with a bruised lip, but inked names and sums that smelled of business. He left the Zenzala with the same pairing of stealth he used to enter the big house. Men hurried past him, their faces lit with torches, carrying the night's confusion like a commodity. From the shadow of a banana tree, he watched Valadares marshal men and issue commands. The Capitão wore his authority like a well-fitting coat. The movements were practiced. The voice that told men how to burn was a blunt instrument he wielded without hesitation. Bento waited until Valadares moved away, first to organize a line of torches, then to call for ropes and pitchers that would be used in ritual punishments, and then slipped forward. At the main house, the staff hurried in a more formal panic. Footmen cruised between the service wing and the master's parlor, with the kind of stateliness that came from having been trained to make crisis look like decorum. Servants in clean shirts passed on messages, carrying sealed missives and lamps, while the Barão's steward barked orders as if he were used to saving reputations with the force of a pencil. Bento watched the flows of bodies and found his moment when a boy, a stable hand who doubled as a carrier, a lanky thing with hands forever occupied in redressing saddles, raced past him, hauling a bundle of linens to the master's chamber. The boy's gait was ungainly. He knocked against a column and muttered a curse as he corrected himself. Bento moved as if tripping accidentally into the boy, his shoulder striking the bundle with the kind of clumsy force that would excuse a spill. He had practiced the motion earlier, catching the satchel under the saddle horn and feeling the papers beneath his shirt like a small dangerous oracle. He let the bundle tilt at the precise point where the boy's grip would fail, and the moment the linen spilled, his fingers slipped a corner of paper from beneath his shirt and released it to the floor. The boy swore, bent, and scrambled to pick up the cloth. In the scramble, the slip of inked paper swept free and skittered like a frightened insect across the highly polished boards of the hall. There were already a dozen eyes in the corridor. Servants moved with the quickness of people who understood that a master's displeasure could travel faster than the morning. One of the footmen, a thin man with a face like a coin, stooped and brushed the paper with a doffing of a hand that made it look like common garbage. But the paper did not vanish. A page caught on the hem of a tablecloth and fluttered into the path of a passing steward, who paused, frowned, and picked it up more carefully than the rest. It took the Barão a moment to be roused. Men had instructions. A master could be spared a scandal if his servants were adept at filtering ruin. But the steward's fingers had a habit of being curious. He brought the scrap to a tray of other papers and, like a man used to arranging the accounts of a house, smoothed the page with a practiced, almost affectionate motion. The inked sums and names caught him. He pushed the tray down the corridor to the master's chamber, where the Barão had roused himself from his bed at the sound of commotion, and now sat with his nightshirt open and sweat on the line between his eyes, a man momentarily concerned not by blood and loss, but by inventory of harm. When the Barão unfolded the paper, his face changed in a way that was not immediately readable as fury or fear. He read one line and then another, names, amounts, times, small numerals that indicated a regularity of trade. Then he saw the signature that was his first betrayal, Valadares's shorthand at the bottom of a receipt. That one mark unstitched a specialization of trust. The Barão was a man who had the luxury of calculations and thin mercies. The idea that one of his officers had been transacting in the bodies of children while keeping the house's margins tidy struck him as an affront not only to profit, but to his reputation among peers. "Valadares," he said at last, his voice quiet but edged. He did not look like a man about to moralize. He looked like a man whose ledger had been tampered with and whose future reputation was at stake. "Bring him to me." The steward, with a face that had seen many small betrayals, bowed and went to find Valadares. Word moved like oil down the hall. By the time the Capitão arrived, he had a swagger meant to recalibrate the space, authority. When he entered the Barão's chamber and caught sight of the paper, his throat tightened only for a heartbeat. Then the performance of control returned like armor. "You bring me accusations?" Valadares asked, all practiced calm. His face bristled with a man who was used to having men believe in his explanations. He knew for certain the damage a paper could make, and the ways men with ledgers could be turned sharp against a subordinate. He tried to frame himself as the wronged officer who would help root out criminals, but the Barão's eyes were narrow. "It is not an accusation," the Barão said. "It is a record." His hand tapped the paper as if counting the sins with the tip of his finger. "These receipts have names. They have amounts. They tie you to a trade I did not authorize." Valadares's mouth hardened. "Master, the ledger, these are small exchanges, herds, supplies. If there is a name—" The Barão cut him off. "The signatures are yours, Capitão. Either you are honest and you will explain these lines, or you are a thief in my house and I will see that you answer that label before the magistrate." There was a pause that tasted like a gamble. Valadares knew how far his arrogance could carry him, up to the point where the master's displeasure became a blade he could not parry. His hands, though, betrayed micro-movements of worry. He glanced to the doorway where servicemen clustered, then back at the paper, as if it could be dissolved by looking hard enough. "I should be allowed to explain," Valadares said finally, "but a man who would fabricate charges would choose a place like this to strike." The Barão's face made a small, elegant decision. He would make an example not of the Cenzala, but of the man who had betrayed his house. Valadares's greed had been a quiet convenience until that night. Now it threatened the Barão's standing. A single death could be framed as an accident. A pattern of dealing in children was a scandal that could ripple into judgments from other landowners and magistrates. For the Barão, reputation was the thing that turned violence into order and order into profit. "Arrest him," the Barão ordered, and the command had the finality of a closing ledger. One does not trade in the master's name. Valadares' jaw worked. He understood being punished by the same house he had enriched. He also understood the danger of being captured by a law that would prefer to cut its own throat rather than own complicity. He snarled something under his breath, a threat toward men who were already shifting toward catching him. The scene moved with the efficiency of men used to crisis. Ropes were found, hands were slapped with manacles, and Valadares' flinch at the indignity was visible in the clench of his fingers. But anger does not follow only one map. Valadares was a man practiced in coercion, and he had other tools besides the force of being bullied. He had friends in the guard, men who understood that loyalty sometimes came with the promise of favors. The moment the word arrest left the Barão's lips, Valadares' face moved through an arithmetic of escape and offense. A pistol, kept among his belt as an emblem of rank, appeared with a rapid movement, an act both surprising and not. "They will not take me without proof," he said, but his tone had the edge of a man who would use proof to carve his own path out of shame. A hand reached for the weapon. Someone grabbed Valadares' wrist. Fingers slapped the iron out of his palm. The shock startled men into motion. A scuffle, the sound of furniture moving, the metallic clink that signaled an escalation. Valadares lashed out then, not with a legal appeal, but with a brute reaction. He shoved, his shoulder struck a steward, and for a moment the room was a tangle of limbs and curses. Shots followed like weather. They were not many and they were not deft. One cracked through the heavy drapery, another found a doorframe. A bullet grazed a steward's cheek and sent blood smearing like a red signature across his collar. In the chaos, Valadares tried to force an exit, but men's bodies and a rope now meant to pin him conspired against him. A final exchange, a snap and a shout, left Valadares on the floor, clutching his side where warmth pooled dark through his clothing. He had been hit. The cry that came from him was animal and human at once, a sound that claimed both pain and the loss of a plan. The Barão, who had commanded the arrest, blinked at the wound with a face that measured outcome rather than grief. He called for men to fetch a doctor, and for Valadares to be bound and held. The steward, who had first read the paper, folded it and put it into a drawer as if proving the links between names and signatures was now a possession to be used in the house's internal justice. The room's moral arithmetic changed quickly. The Capito's wound was a problem of law and reputation, not of vengeance toward the Cenzala. Men who had been ready to burn huts now had a man to parade. Outside, men still looked at the Cenzala with the old instinct to punish, but the Barão's chest puffed in a way to claim a different narrative. He would show decisiveness by delivering Valadares to the magistrate, and in doing so, he would spare his own property the spectacle of torched huts. Bento watched all of this like someone observing a stage-change scenery. The paper had done its small exact work. It produced not perfect justice, but a reallocation of fear. Valadares' fall became a lever that postponed the threat to the Cenzala. Bento felt a relief that was mellow and bitter at once. The old cook's eyes had found his across the yard for the briefest of seconds, and in that look there was gratitude that did not require words. Zulerma's breathing, somewhere beyond the line of huts, was steady. But the night had a cost. Valadares, in the dramatics that followed, was injured and would face consequences that likely included incarceration and ruin. The Barão had been spared a scandal beyond the bounds of his household, but the system that had allowed children to be traded continued like a machine. The men who had been at Brando's cabin returned to the scene with stories of a dying overseer, and with the smell of sweat and salt on their shirts. Some said Brando had expired in the bed, others insisted he had been delirious, and clawed at his skin until the men could not comfort him. Either way, the result was that the overseer's capacity to continue his trade had been finished. There was no celebration among the Cenzala. The old cook's face was a map of the long winters, and her mourning was thin and quiet. Bento felt some fancied justice in Brando's silence, but he could not let that feeling stand alone against the possible nights of retribution that might come. As the Barão's men escorted Valadares off the property toward the town's jail, their torches bobbing like the slow teeth of a creature, Bento made his own choice. He would not leave until he knew the child was physically hidden in a place where men would not look. He also had to see that the papers, now in the steward's hand, would be used as the wedge he had intended, not to feed a different tyrant, but to split one from the other and buy the Cenzala time. He returned to the Cenzala and found the old cook sitting against the hut's end, her eyes on the door as if she expected men with torches to arrive at any second. Zulerma slept now, with the light that fell from the low window painting her face in a small rectangle. Bento sat beside the old woman and felt the thrum in his side, where earlier a boot had slammed into him when he had been shoved in the scuffle near the barn, an ache that was sharp under the ribs, a bruise forming in a place he could not quite cover with his fingers. He had been hit by a man's elbow, as Valadares's attempt to seize a pistol had created a small collision near the stable. It was hardly a wound fit for the doctor's notice, but it left him breathy and slow. "We have room for one more night," the old cook said. She spoke slowly, and there was the impression of someone cataloguing possibilities. "He took her because he could. He will be missed in time. But the men who would make us pay tonight, if they come, will find the Barão turn toward his own." Bento nodded. He had the satisfaction of a plan that worked, but also the knowledge that one night did not change a system. The Cenzala slept a little less under threat now, and a child breathed free for a night. That was not nothing. Word of the night's event spread as it always did. Cocked heads, whispers over pans, the hush of people who know that rumor is both a weapon and a comfort. By dawn, the Barão had sent riders to town. Valadares was to be held, and the steward had been instructed to keep the receipts safe. The news gave the Cenzala a brittle hope. Men sat together in thin groups and argued softly about whether this would mean lighter hands or a tightened belt. Some muttered that luck had been unkind that night, and another man had paid for the overseer's crimes. Bento watched the morning like a man who counts the cost of every action before closing an account. He walked through the yard with the sun lifting the edges of things into sharpness. The cane collapsed in the field, the mill's wheel catching light, the thatched roofs steaming faintly in the heat. There were small consequences that no file could account for. Brando's bed would be salted and burned. The overseer's household objects would be carted away. The Cenzala would not be burned, at least not that morning, and for that Bento felt a cautious pride. But men were not yet content to let the matter rest in the courtrooms. Valadares's allies muttered revenge. Some guards who had been loyal to him plotted small acts of reprisal. Bento had not meant to create a cycle of vengeance. He had intended to use the plantation's own materials against a man who had been killing children for coin. Yet vengeance took on a life of its own, and the day after created ripples that were uneven and likely to bruise more than the initial targets. That afternoon there was a scene that nearly undid the fragile truce. A small group of men loyal to Valadares found an excuse to enter the Cenzala under the pretext of searching for accomplices. They came in the heat and under the watchful eye of a returning guard who had not yet decided which side to stand on. There were mutterings and then a shove, and then a hand that slapped a man's shoulder so hard the man fell. The old cook stood between the intruders and the huts like a rock before water. "Keep your hands," she said. Her voice, though thin, had an authority that came from years of being the one who tied wounds and told children when to eat. The guard, watching the scene, hesitated. Those who had come with Valadares wanted spectacle. They wanted to make men confess to crimes they had not committed. Bento, who had been sitting on the rim of a well, stood. He stepped in with the flat courage of someone who understood the geometry of a face-off. He did not threaten. He reasoned. He offered names and explanations with a voice that had the low patience of argument. He told them that the Barão had his own process, and that further indignities would only make the house send men who would be less forgiving. There was a moment when the group wavered. The chance to punch and shout was a seductive one, but so was the instinct for self-preservation. They left with grumbles. The old cook nodded once at Bento, and the Cenzala breathed out as if unclenching. There were other small costs. A boy who had helped carry bedding the night before had been taken for questioning and returned with a split lip. Some men had been beaten in the yards of the barns the morning after, but none of the huts had been torched. These were small mercies, and they were paid for with pain. The Barão's justice, when it arrived in town, was precise in a way that made the Cenzala feel far from the center. Valadares would be held and tried for his apparent role in clandestine trades. The Barão would present the paper ledger as proof, and the magistrate would be drawn into a case that would be decided among men who counted reputation and favor. For those in the Senzala, the legal machinery was remote. What mattered was the everyday calculus of whether a man with a whip might be replaced by another with a ledger. Bento's wound throbbed in the weeks that followed. It was a bruise that pulsed whenever he lifted a saddle or bent to pick up a pan. He would wince when the rhythm of his breath matched the strain of lifting a horse's flank. The old cook would sigh and press a poultice to his side, her hands experienced in the touch of healing. It was a minor pain compared to the scars that lived in his memory, the look on Zulema's face the day Brando had first come near her, the hush of the Senzala when a child had been taken. He treated his rib with a humility earned through the slow math of survival. The days after the night changed the composition of life at the plantation only by degrees. The Barão reported Valadares to the magistrate and encouraged the town's officials to take steps that would distance the estate from the stain of private trade. Men in town who had benefited from Valadares' dealings felt the needle of the scandal and made quiet adjustments. The mill kept turning. The cane still burned in the evenings. The systemic violence remained, but one artery of its trade had been cut. For some people that amounted to hope, for others it was only a temporary rearrangement of power. There were public effects. The Barão paraded Valadares before certain men as a gesture of his own righteousness. There were hearings where the steward and a few servants gave testimony. Some called for brutal punishments. Others saw a chance for the Barão to appear merciful by not directing vengeance at the Senzala. The Senzala itself was watched. Inspectors and curious magistrates came to ensure that the Barão's hands were clean. Their presence felt like a shadow that might lift or fall. People in the huts lived more carefully, keeping their voices low in a way that made laughter rare and prized. Bento kept to the margins of that public narrative. He did not seek credit. He knew the kind of danger that came with being honored in a household where reputation was currency. He returned to his work at the stables, tending to horses by routine and by silence. He mended harnesses with hands steady enough to forget pain for hours, yet he was not untouched by the consequences. He found himself thinking often, in a way that was not restful, about the cost of using nature in a plan of reprisal. The ants had been agents only in the material sense. They had responded to sugar and instinct. The moral responsibility lay with the man who poured the sugar and the system that made the pour necessary. At night, he would sometimes stand outside the Senzala and watch the stars. He would see Zulema's small shape moving in the dim light and feel a satisfaction that was fierce and incomplete. Other things bothered him. The men who had been beaten in the aftermath, the restless loyalties that still threaded through the guards, the knowledge that a new overseer would come and that the system of whipping and selling would continue under another name until law and politics changed decades hence. He recognized that he had not broken the chain. He had put a stone under one of its links. There were evenings when he sat with the old cook, and they would exchange small practical knowledge: where to find a bandage that would not sting, how to disguise a wound to avoid drawing the master's notice. They spoke rarely of the night's philosophy, preferring to share labor and small jokes that kept their spirits intact. The old cook liked to tell stories about the children she had tended over decades, and in those stories Zulema was already as permanent as any child she had known. Bento listened, and let the small warmth of those tales keep him from sinking into bitterness. Occasionally men came from other estates, whispering of what had happened to Valadares in town. Some said he had been fined. Others said he had been kept in chains for a month. Rumors varied, and none satisfied. The Barão, for his part, used the scandal to exhibit himself as a man of order. He dispatched a small speech to the magistrate and allowed a formal inquiry to proceed, a procedural cleansing that made other landowners inclined to nod in agreement. But the underlying transaction of bodies continued beyond the plantation's fence, in other places where men found ways to skirt the law. The news died down with time and with the rhythm of harvest. Bento's action had created an opening, but not a reformation. That truth sat in his chest with the bruise he had acquired. He had saved a child. He had incurred danger for himself and for others. He had pulled at a thread and watched the fabric shift, but he could not claim to have altered the pattern for all. Months later, when the cane fields boiled under a last heat and the mill's wheel slowed for a day of repair, A rider from town brought a short note to the Barão. The Barão read it and made arrangements more quietly than he had the last time. Some men would be punished in small ways, fines, reassignment, and modest public disgrace. Valadares, who had once been a shadow on the yard like a threat of rain, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. The people at the Senzala listened to the news with relief that was careful, like people who feel their breath in their mouths and hold it out slowly. Zulerma grew a little taller that season. Bento watched her from a distance sometimes, like a man who sees what he saved and wants nothing more than for it to thrive. She began to help the old cook with small tasks, carrying water, sweeping the hearth, and her laugh came back in odd silver trills that made the old cook smile with a tenderness Bento felt he had earned and also not deserved. In the evenings, the Senzala's light was less harsh. Men who had been ready to turn the night into punishment found other routines to busy their hands. Bento found a small steadiness in the work that healed him in increments. He mended saddles and felt the leather warm under his palms. He brushed down a stallion and watched the steam curl from its coat, as if the beast were exhaling some of the plantation's heat. But he did not forget. He did not forget bloodless nights when Brando's hands had been heavy with money, or the look on Zulerma's face as men shuffled coins. Memory persisted in him as a ledger that refused to close. He would sometimes imagine the conversation he might have at a different table. A magistrate, a reformer, someone in authority who might take more than a paper and a public arrest to uproot the practices that kept children vulnerable. Those imaginings were not naive. They were small keys he kept in his pocket next to the other ones. One night toward the end of the harvest, as the sky grew soft and the air cooled to something like mercy, Bento sat by a small fire outside the Senzala. The old cook had gone to bed, and Zulerma slept, a thin silhouette beneath the blanket. Bento propped his back against a post and pressed his hand to his side where the bruise still throbbed occasionally like a reminder. He thought of Brando's cabin and of the jar of molasses and the ants that had followed. He felt the shadow of what he'd done, a necessary cruelty that had toppled a greater cruelty at least for a time. He simply poured honey into the overseer's ear, he thought, and tasted the bitter ring of the phrase. The image surprised him with its simplicity and with the truth of its arithmetic. Sweetness had called an indifferent hunger that did not ask questions. It had set in motion a sequence that had saved and harmed, that had reshuffled power in a way that bought a child a night. A soft wind moved through the yard and carried with it a smell of distant sugar, of cane, of the far-off wheel. Bento closed his eyes. He felt tired in a way that was different from physical work. It was a weariness of the moral sort, shaped by the knowledge that one act could not undo centuries of industry built on forced labor. But he also felt, underneath it, a stubborn warmth. He had not become a hero. He had not freed more than a few. He had risked his life and found his body marked for a while. He had been part of a small exact contest with injustice, and in that contest he had taken a measure of satisfaction that tasted like ash and sugar. The world was not clean because of him. It had shifted in one seam, and in that shift, certain nights would be different. People who had watched him did not see the full ledger, only the single line that had been altered. In the dim light, Zulerma turned in her sleep and murmured. Bento's hand went instinctively to her hair, smoothing it with a tenderness that felt like reparation in miniature. The old cook, watching from the doorway, said nothing. She only smiled once, thin and fierce. "What now?" he asked the empty yard. It was a question with no one to answer but the black sky. The Senzala's life continued. Children were fed porridge, carts moved, the mill started back up. Men who had been ready to punish looked at their hands and found them less certain. The Barão slept with the knowledge that he had avoided a scandal, but he also carried the seed of change that is always slow and sometimes cruel. Valadares's fate would be determined by men who weighed reputation with firmness. Brando would not return to sell children. For that, Bento held a small, fierce relief. Yet the moral question lingered. He had used the landscape, the ants, the sweetness, to do what hands and legal recourse would not allow. The act had been strategic and effective. It had broken an immediate threat, but had not promised structural transformation. That ambiguity lived in him like a quiet companion. Years later, long after the cane had been cut, and after the Barão's stead had become something slightly different under new hands, men still told the story in whispers. They told it as rumor, as legend, as something to warn children about the consequences of cruelty. Some praised Bento's cunning, others hushed the telling with reminders of the night's violence. The truth, as always, sat between those two responses. On the night when the story first circulated beyond the plantation, talked over the fences in town, repeated with curve and emphasis, Bento was already away from the immediate conflict. He had chosen, as men often do when danger dims, to continue living the life he knew. He mended leather, kept a low profile, and measured his days in the steady work of animals and harness. He visited Zulerma sometimes and saw her shoulders bloom with the slow sturdiness of a child who had been spared a fate worse than a hard life. She would sometimes look at him and smile, a smile that had the trust of a person who has been given a reprieve. Yet, even as the years turned, he understood that his action was a single stone, cast into a big, slow river. It made ripples, but did not change the current's direction. He had used the tools at hand to save a life and to strike at one man, but the plantation's logic remained. Men would continue to count profit in the faces of people until law, pressure, and time reshaped their appetite. He kept the jar of molasses in memory, the way a soldier keeps medals, an object of weight and of reflection. He never told his story as boast. He told it only when the telling might help another person understand how a small, precise act could be a blade rather than a torch. He would say, when asked, that what mattered was the intention and the knowledge of consequence. He would say that sometimes nature could be used as an instrument without ascribing to it the qualities of justice, that the moral weight stayed with the maker. On the evening when he sat once more at the fire, the harvest done for another season and the Cenzala calmer if not healed, he watched Zulerma sleep with the same small care he had always shown. The old cook sat nearby, humming something small and indecipherable. Bento pressed his hand to his side and felt the bruise, now a small hard knot of memory. He thought of the Barão, a man who had used courts and papers to protect his reputation. He thought of Valadares, a man whose greed had been his undoing. He thought of Brandão, a creature of cruelty silenced in the most ordinary of ways by the indifferent appetite of army ants. He thought of the Cenzala's people and their small acts of survival and resistance that went unrecorded. And then he said softly to the night and perhaps to himself, words that were not an absolution but an inventory. I poured honey into an overseer's ear and waited for the ants to arrive. It worked, for a night. He let the sentence settle like a stone in a slow river. He did not expect to be forgiven, nor did he seek to be absolved. He had acted because he could not bear another child's hand being sold like a sack of sugar. He had done harm to save one. That was the arithmetic he carried. It was a hard, honest balance. Relief dampened with guilt, action marked by consequence. The fire leaned low. In the hut, Zulerma breathed on, the old cook's hands folded on her knees. Bento watched the child's chest rise and fall and thought about how justice could never be only one night's work. He would keep his place at the stable. He would tend to horses and mend harnesses, and perhaps in small ways teach others how to read the signs of men whose hands were too quick for good. The story would be told and retold, sometimes with added boasts or omissions. People would argue whether he had been justified. They would call him both savior and sinner. The arguments did not unsettle him. He had made his choice and lived with it. He had bought a child's night of safety with a measure of danger and a bruise on his ribs. That was the ledger he kept. As the last coals winked into ash, he rose, crossed the yard, and looked one last time at the child who had slept through the storm he'd helped make. He touched her hair, gentle as a hand that had been used to steady horses, and, without making promises he could not keep, mouthed to himself the one hope that fit the arc of his life, that one night might be the beginning of many small refusals to trade a child's future for a coin. He had poured the sweetness into an ear, and let life follow its indifferent hunger. It had yielded a result that was neither wholly clean nor wholly damned. He had acted within a system that devoured as it spun, and he had taken for himself the knowledge that some actions are necessary, because the alternative is silence. He turned then, back toward the stable, toward the horses, who would need his hands at dawn, and carried the memory of the night like an ache and like a comfort. The plantation continued around him, slow and thick, but somewhere within its motion there would be nights when a child slept, because someone had chosen a complicated kind of resistance. At the end, the question remained, was Bento justified? The answer sat in the spaces between his relief and his guilt, and in the mouths of those who would argue the morality of a single precise strike against a cruel man. It was not for him to resolve. He could only continue to tend to life in the ways he could, and to hold in a bruised hand the bitter sweetness of the night he had chosen to act.